believe. The operative journalists are contingent when they become operative, and they basically feel that they have the proxy to negotiate the truth. Now, that kind of talk goes all the way to the arbiter of the truth being the Pope. So you're seeing that this is linked into religion, culture, tradition, civil authorities, and so forth. What that means is that the scope of the paradox that's being created here by going to consensus reality away from inquiry, the paradox is widened to embrace ecclesiastical law of the soul, common law, and the myth of the rule of law. And essentially, the media is playing the public mind as a royal court. In other words, you don't have to have any station, you just have the royal media courts assemble, and they indict whoever they want based on plausible guilt. All of the operative journalism and the media groups that have prosecuted these wars in the Middle East are certainly deserving of a grand jury indictment for using the D5E military protocol when they claim to be civilian institutions. And that's the way it is. That's reality land. The opinion, when they allow people to have an opinion, what they're trying to do is avoid the truth. Opinions are always used to avoid the truth. That's just your opinion. We never speak to our opinion within Infraspect audits. We say, this is our direct observation for witnesses. So we go in with a team of witnesses in interdisciplinary structure, and we go in, examine what we need to find out, and we tell our clients, here's what we found, and it's up to you to decide, where you want to go with it. There's no question that this is in play. And the people that, just think of this, 70% of the conspiracy theories prove out to be true in time. And there was a time when the New World Order dialogue was considered conspiracy theory. Now it's just simply a matter of fact and planning, implementation. The problem with that, and a lot of the people that are good researchers understand that bigger is not always better. The dichotomy rests in how do you make a local community feel that they're empowered? Well, you tell them you're going to have local law. You're going to have communitarian law. And it isn't really. The handlers come into a local community, including the media, and they make sure to fix the agenda, the dialogue, the discussions, the whole thing. Now, in this manipulation, there's different components. There's social relationships. There's what they call pre-persuasion tactics. There's message tactics. There's emotional tactics, and so forth. There are several experts in the field that take this from various avenues, various venues, and points of view. But what we found in converging this is that we have a good audit approach to understanding the problems. Doesn't matter left, right, middle. People are fooling themselves, and when they engage in these functional arguments between the so-called Democratic Party and the Republican Party, these are party line politics. And what we see in the media is a constant trying to synthesize always to the common purpose. And the common purpose becomes values required in civil organization. People, sooner or later, they get to the point of values neutral. I don't want to be judgmental, and everybody's okay, and we're all just folks.
I just want to stay below the radar.
Over and over again.
I just want to stay below the radar. I don't want to call attention to myself. And that plays right into what you talk about on the consensus. If you go to a meeting and you keep your mouth shut and you just stay below the radar, you don't speak up, you automatically become part of the consensus, don't you?
There's different forms of consent, and that is an acquiescence to consent. And I've seen it played out in many public hearings in many forms in 43 years. Basically, silence certainly has a value, yet in the public forums, it's preyed upon because when they set the emotional dialogue, a certain person is probably not going to speak up when they should. They're afraid to. And that goes into the idea of the status-conscious individuals, the bandwagon effect, going along to get along. And people are very submissive. And the country has been kept as a whole in a state of stress. No matter what the economists say, they measure the economy by the stock market, which is a fraud in itself. So what happens is that the people are under austerity programming stress, and the environmental community has really tried to switch sides now with enterprise environmentalism, and we're all going to be, we're going to make global warming a new economy. Well, actually, global climate change. So you're looking at a bunch of sophist economists, those kinds of personalities, trying to sell a new distribution of assets, natural assets, conversion of assets to debt collateral and so forth. Overall, nothing has changed. It's still a debt situation. I'll give you an example. The indigenous people throughout America were creditors. They owned their place. They say they never did, but the people went to work on them saying, oh, you don't own anything, and the God owns it all, and blah, blah, blah. Well, at that point, they were being taken to the cleaners, literally. So they were creditors, and now they are debtors. Their entire reservation, the failed state reservation is a debtor's economy. You pay, you get a little bit. The supply lines are mostly remote, and it costs more to get consumables and energies into a reservation setting. And for the most part, they are a failed state reservation. Now, with that in mind, how do you break the veil? Well, you've got to get through the media in Indian country that is really on board, all on the same page. And they're not coming from a truly indigenous protocol. They're coming, which is valid for thousands upon thousands of years. They're coming from an institutional kind of a mindset where education is important, certainly, but they go into the university and they come back and they are speech encoded. You can read a lot of tribal program manuals, and you're not going to see anything indigenous in there. You're going to see program, institutional concept, and speech encoding and modeling. Now, that means that you really have a false sustainable development. The development's really more like a aggregate reallocation to provisional beneficiaries that meet the standards. Who are setting the standards? The ICO EMS system sets the standards. That trickles down into the U.S. EPA, and that trickles down into various jurisdictions, state, and so forth. And you'll see ISO EMS standards in state ordinances, statutes, especially agency protocols. And the idea was, well, we're going to all go synthesize, and the world-class scientist says this. Well, the world-class scientist said a couple hundred years ago that the world was flat. Gee, somebody made a mistake. Well, now they changed it, and they change it, and they change it to suit their prerogatives. So now we're at a point where we're looking at where is this going, and what is it going to mean for all the people? Because remember that the Constitution was made up of sovereign people. The government's not a sovereign. That's a piece of paper, white paper. The people always remain the sovereign. And now we have a perversion of that to the point where the municipal is the sovereign, the corporation is sovereign, the state is a sovereign. All that's not true. If you look at ecclesiastical law and you look at common law and the myth of rule and law, you'll see that according to some of the world deciders, none of them are sovereign. The only sovereign exist is in the religious orders. So we're looking at basically why are they doing this? And certainly if you get into the depopulation theorists and you see what they're doing, you'll see that it's very class-oriented. It's very targeting certain kinds of intellectual capability, capacity. And we're seeing certainly we've seen it in this country, the middle class is fallen into the lower class, and some have been recruited into higher class. All of those higher class people are mostly going to be involved with stock market and derivative speculation of one kind or another. The consuming public is down there where they're living paycheck to paycheck, even though the economic priests will say, no, it's better than that. It is not better than that. And I could use the failed state reservations as an absolute demonstration, and especially in where distributions like the Cobell money is on Cobell 3. Basically, they're having to pay because they got caught at some shenanigans of not using the money. Cobell money literally ended up in the stock market speculation. So why the bailouts? And they said it over and over again. Use your Cobell money. You can now pay off your past due bills. So we're using this subsidy, this distribution subsidy, to pay off a debt, which is past due. Now, what's going on? Are they out of the woods? No, they're going to pay off their creditors, the debts they owe, and then they're going to be right back in the same hole under a system where they're saying, well, we're going to tax the Indians. Who are they going to tax? The low-income people? No, they're going to tax the people that they're going to lease Indian lands to. And this is opening up in the Keystone negotiations and so forth. The pipelines are all about giving government institutions money. Money. And it's called legal plunder. In other words, we'll give you a right-of-way through our reservation. You make sure that the tribal government gets the money. So once again, the tribal government becomes the primary employer through programs and derivative kinds of ideas. Is that the kind of government they want? And the answer to a lot of Indian country economists and so forth is yes. We want what? What is that called when the government is the employer? There's a name for it.
Communism.
Well, it's going to get worse. So when you're dealing with those three items, Marxism, communism, fascism is merely interchangeable given the political moment. And it's kind of a vicious circle. So when we look at these kind of situations, we always go back to what is the media doing? Because they're the ones that are going to be on the vanguard of trying to insert an idea into the public mind. Unfortunately, when people are very stressed, such as in failed state reservations, they're not thinking very well. They're thinking only survival. They're not thinking creativity. The conflicts are on. And the conflicts are generating and accelerating between the nepotistic structure, usually the power structure, the families, the relatives that are getting the jobs, and those that are on the outer fringe area, meaning those that do not agree with the current form of corruption or plunder or don't agree with the politics, and they're out. So you're looking at probably, I would say safely, a sustained unemployment rate in Indian country, and I mean real sustained, probably 65%. And so in come the fixers, in come the media to give good PR to the government programs that are fixing things. Well, they're not fixing anything. There's no history of anything being fixed, and the evidence is very clear. Look at all of the depredative rates around reservations. Look at their water. Look at their environment. Look at their people. And you're still looking at massive media manipulation of what's going on. Inquiry is out. Consensus reality is in. You can't use the word genocide. You can't use the word chemtrail. I'll give you an example of how bad this gets. In New Mexico, a particular consortium of tribal authorities knew that the chemtrails were creating synergistic toxicity. That means all kinds of health problems, which are now on the books, now known. And what they said was this: we're all going to shut up because this is going to hurt our casino business. What is a casino? Is that where you go get healthy? No, it's where you go speculate and you gamble. You gamble on gathering some monetary asset. And the problem is this: a lot of Indian people go to the casinos because that has replaced the job they don't have. And it's a revolving door, and it happens in Nevada, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, and it's getting worse. The casino culture is alive and well, but it does not serve all the people. There is kind of a spin-off. If you look at the spin-off coefficients off a casino, it's embarrassing because it's depicted in the actual lack of people don't have savings accounts, don't have natural assets, don't have a backup. HUD housing, when you get to the HUD housing level in a tribal reservation, you're just about finished. You're being housed, and you're no longer in a viable state. You don't have creative options. And that's what's going on in this country as a wide profile. People are living more and more paycheck to paycheck. And it's humorous because I've heard rich people tell me, you know, I had to sell one of my condos. Times are tough.
Well, you know, these FEMA camps that were supposedly a conspiracy theory are being built, and they are now making it illegal in some cities, some of these metroplexes that you refer to. They're making it illegal to be homeless, and so if you're homeless, they want to move you into one of these FEMA camps, and you've got to you can leave. You're not exactly incarcerated. You can leave if you get permission, if you take the bus, if you take and you got to check in to come back. So they're really putting these FEMA camps to use, and they're creating more and more homeless. And it was Thomas Jefferson that warned us, if you ever allow a private bank to issue your money, the banks and the corporations that spring up around them will leave your children homeless in the land that we conquered. They don't want you to be self-sufficient. They have sent the jackbooted thugs into a little place up there in Arlington, Texas, called the Garden of Eden, where they were growing their own food, and they stomped on all their tomatoes, I guess, and didn't arrest anybody, didn't take anybody to jail. Nobody had done anything wrong. They just tried to terrorize people that were feeding the whole neighborhood. Is that what
we've addressed this through weaponized immigration, certainly affecting Texas and the border states, as well as screening point differentials. And what that does, it shows how you move these so-called undocumented immigrants, which have expanded. Basically, they're felony trespassers, but they're being forgiven and brought in not only as a cheap labor seasonal asset, human asset, but they're being brought in also because there's a contingency that will go into the prison system, the military, and the FEMA resocialization camps. Now, the gateway into that to look at it is going to look at the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act and start springing from there into the other parallel authorities that address all these matters. And that'll tell you what's going on there. But in the American Correctional Corporation, they presented papers to Indian country that basically said this: we'll come in and we'll build prisons for you. Corporate, in other words, you'll have corporate cops, corporate courts, and corporate prisons. But you got to guarantee us that you'll keep them filled at least 90%. So what's been going on constantly, and this is a long thing, 35 years that I've been aware of it, and basically on an audit level, was looking at what is the American Correctional Corporation, what does it do? The difference between a corporation like that and a officer, you see an officer, a policeman, like a county officer is elected and takes an oath of allegiance. Corporate officers are just making a loyalty promise to the corporation. In Browning, Montana, for instance, the Blackfeet Reservation has a court. It's really a corporate court. It's chartered under the state of Montana, but the Indian people actually believe it's a tribal court, and it is not. It is not. This goes on here in the West all over. And an example would be the corporate cops that are in local communities, local cities, here, everywhere. They're actually corporations. They're basically paid for rent-a-cops. And their recruiting system is very curious and very important. As we address this in the police abuse matrix, levels of awareness, levels of alert. There's 5 levels. And what we see is that the recruiting process for your local corporate policeman kind of thing is that they're looking for people with a background in the military, preferably someone who has shot somebody at a screening point, a checkpoint. In other words, somebody that shot somebody to prevent escape or shot them because they were disobedient. They want that kind of a impunity built into the policeman. Now, that's different from a peace officer. Police and peace officer are different. So what you're seeing in a lot of the county area is they're being infiltrated, and they're picking up more and more Homeland Security benefits and materials and supplies and commodities to keep their operations going under so-called budget cuts. That's another fiat operation, because the CAFRA system, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports of most entities, show they're well into the green, they have lots of assets, but the budgets are fake fiat budgets to show that they're at a deficit and they have to cut programs. And you'll always see the same pattern. Well, we had to cut more programs, and then somebody walks in the door that's got some pull and power and says, I want the money for this program, and they say, oh, well, we found some money. So you're looking at liars. And the media is a partner in this. Constantly the media covers with the official story, the storyline, all of these things, always back to the media, because if you don't have an inquiring kind of a mind in the media, you're going to end up with a consensus dictate. In other words, like in the chemtrails Searchlight publication, we don't use the word chemtrails. Now, I've seen this in Indian country where they don't allow them to use the word Holocaust or genocide when they're describing the invasion and the extermination under total warfare tactics. Now, remember, total warfare tactics didn't originate with the cavalry. It came from somewhere. It came from Europe, and then there's a whole bunch of history and background on total warfare and how it's executed and prosecuted. So always back to the media. In the next 3 months, the media is going to have to do what they usually do in the oligarchs, the hierarchies, the agencies. They have to betray their own words. And you're going to see the media accelerating the betrayal of their own words. That will have to happen because they need to switch sides to keep themselves safe. Because the first order of any insurrection or any kind of thing, and you can look at counterinsurgency manuals, the Capstone thing, is they go in and wreck their communications. And right now you have a wrecked communication in the United States. You have basically think globally, act locally. That's pretty much, you're going to end up looking at personalities that are well into that tractable and trained level, not educated per se, but more trained. And the evidence is there about these mind control techniques and brainwashing and so forth. When we see it used in the media, we know that they're enhancing and escalating the paradox, which is they're killing the truth and replacing it with consensus reality, which is merely I believe. And then this goes back once again into the ADL and potentiality prosecution. Most of the time you'll see, especially in social domestic affairs, that the prosecutions are based on potentiality. They don't need evidence anymore. They just need a few experts in the room to say that the kid should be taken away from the parents and so forth. That's what's going on. And we can look at Indian country and see it as a microcosm of the greater negative and perverse influences. And it seems always that Indian country becomes a dumping ground for the worst of the personalities that basically jump into the fiefdom, as Indian people call it, the fiefdom. And the lawyers walk away with millions and dumb everybody down, keep it simple, and it's a great big process of fraud, conversion, and denial. I'm not saying this as an activist. I'm saying this as a professional auditor that has been engaged with this for 43 years. And I assure you, I'm not upset. I'm furious, but I'm not angry.
Now, what I proposed is this revolution, or evolution, whatever you want to call it. We're not really revolting. All I want to do is maintain our Bill of Rights, maintain what we set up here, and restore the individuality of everybody. I mean, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're Indian, whether you're white, whether you're black, you're still an individual, and you should have the same rights as anyone else. The elitists that are out there,
We do.
I beg your pardon?
We do. There's the being, the natural being, the man and the woman already have these attributes of life. What happens is in the positive and negative law, they get into what you shouldn't do to another to protect the system, and that system's integration. Essentially, there are there's 5 constitutional precepts. There's the Constitution of Nature, and that sometimes gets called the laws of nature, including the ways living beings, their nature, tend to behave. The Constitution of Society is a different structure, and it's decision by conventions, by public notice and conducted according to customary rules. Constitution of the state, well, here's where we're at now. We're at the deciders. The society gets suckered into extraterritorial compacts and so forth, and pretty soon location changes representation. In other words, we regionalize, and therefore representation changes. This is as well documented in the manipulation of precincts and voting zones. Precincts are the lowest political form in the United States. They are subordinate at the bottom. The Constitution of Government basically is supposed to go with fundamental law, and it goes with the Constitution of the state. And the Constitution of the state, well, what makes it moral? What makes a constitution moral or having virtues? What you're seeing in a perversion of all the constitutions is that values neutral is taking over. You have various built-in paradox and conflicts, and these are built in on purpose. You have a court system that is evolving to a consensus system. In other words, you can go in court, and if the story fits, the judge says this and the judge says that. There's no court that's not based on politics, religion, psychology, and so forth. All of them are that way. And if you look at the judges and the officers of the courts, you'll see that the Bar Association has a really undue political pressure on the courtroom itself and the bar. They call them bar courts. In Alaska, it's a glaring example of a bar court, the bar controlling the court system. It's an embarrassment to jurisprudence, but the lawyers that belong to the bar are not going to say anything. I've got in front of me the requirements for a bar membership and admission to the bar. And when you go through that and you look at what a lawyer has to go through, you'll see that it's accounting for religion, politics, social associations, and kind of a groupie thing where you got to give references to get on the inside. And as far as I'm concerned, it's just it's become a judicial cult. And that judicial cult is primarily focused on international innovative law arbitrary, merely doing whatever is legal, even if it's unlawful. That's what's going on in the judiciary. There's things that go further, such as the law of Congress, and what is going on with that. What is the law of Congress? Well, Congress is a bunch of deciders and a bunch of collaborators, and they're using positive consensus masked as bipartisan. Bipartisan is not bipartisan. Bipartisan is consensus of the group, whatever that group might be. So basically, you have committees literally overriding legislative affairs, which belong always back to the sovereign people. The trick is they say, well, you elected them. No. Deciders are selected.
I tried to do this right, William. I tried to do it right. I worked with a presidential candidate, a Rhodes Scholar, a former banker, wealthy, educated gentleman by the name of Charles Collins. And Charles wanted to redo and renew Kennedy's Executive Order 11110, creating United States notes. Kennedy was killed, and the first thing Johnson did was recall all of those notes that Kennedy issued. Charles Collins wanted to redo that, and every time he got up to speak, everybody from the media, every cameraman on stage turned their cameras off and pointed them at the ground when Charles spoke. So I realized that we weren't going to make any change by election. That's why I've called for a revolution, because we can't elect anybody, and nobody we've elected, they've all been selected, just as you said. They've been selected, and they were They're only selected if they want to go along and legislate for the bankers, for legislate for their corporate masters that Thomas Jefferson
Well,
warned us about.
What it appears that you're really doing is when you talk to me about this is that you're calling for all what is already happening, and that is the convergence and a conscious raising of the American people in their minds and their discernment and their precepts and their concepts. That's just conscious ascension. That's not a revolution. Revolution is to re. So what you're really calling for is certainly a convergence. The matters that you were talking about are in the indigenous identity theft and fraud technical brief, and there's an attachment on that, attachment 4, and it goes into great detail on the laws and the Supreme Court issues and everything that's going on that apply to this, and also bringing up some of the attachment 1 brings up some of the events and experience that President Kennedy had in confronting 3 basic entities, and he came up against it and certainly ended up dead not too long after that. What hasn't been told is probably the notes that his family still retains on what's going on in behind that, and that would be forthcoming, but some of the people that caused him his grief and so forth and his death probably are not going to allow that, because the media has its marching orders to dispel 911, dispel the Kennedy killing, dispel Waco, and all of these things that were known in thousands of incidents that we've documented in the intrusions case file. And that's based on over 30,000 exhibits now, and it was the technical brief is 760 pages. So we're well qualified on the information that cooperation that goes into this.
Now, if we weren't, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought there.
Okay. The Supreme Court has made some very important decisions over the many decades, and Wu Li was one of them, where you actually the sovereignty really does remain with the people. But even more so, the new regime of international lawyers, in order to create a change as change agents, have gone into innovative international law, and what they're doing is they're treating case law as settled law, in case law style. Actually, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, from which it is supposed to be interpreted, are settled law. In the Indian country dominion, the indigenous dominion, they have settled laws, precepts, concepts, all derived from culture, tradition, everything, custom. It's all there, but they're being hit and injected with common law. And the reason was that common law would create 2 classes. Common law would be basically arriving at dispute settlement between the commoner, these people at the bottom, these consumers, and it was called sumptuary laws. It means you set up a bunch of laws to get rid of a strong middle class, because a strong middle class is not good for the rulers. So sumptuary laws go all the way back into Europe, and they basically set up a different set of immunities and privileges with the aristocratic class. And bear in mind, the Illuminati was an agreement, a working agreement between the barristers and the aristocrats. So when you take it in that context, you come back to collaboration, you come back to the definition of collaboration, conspiracy, you come back into negotiating, basically negotiating who survives and who doesn't. So in these sections in the identity theft, we had to go into great detail on qualified history and substantiated because of the sophistry and the abstract nature of the operative journalists and spokesmen. And you'll always see a spokesman, these anonymous sources, the government sources that the media takes at their word under the guise of official story. Well, the official stories don't match anymore. And the media is certainly trying to figure out a way to regain the trust of people. Right now, they have a major campaign in all the medias, and it is to get the public trust back. And it's clear. They know it. If they do not get the public trust back, especially in these serial warfare campaigns like the War on Terror, they're going to lose the war. And Lyndon Johnson said it in Vietnam. When we lost Cronkite, we lost the war. That's it.
Now,
he said it. Why did he say that?
Who said that? I'm sorry, repeat that.
President Johnson. He said, when we lost Cronkite, we lost the war. And I remember the day that journalist said, I've had enough of this. And he defected. Well, he was CFR guy anyway, but, down the road you find everybody switches around and they betray their own words and they betray one another. And that's the nature of the aristocracy and the oligarchy.
Let me ask you this. I've said that if we had an honest judiciary or an honest Congress, we've got all the proof between my research, and the research that you've done. We actually have enough evidence to put a lot of people in jail if they were ordinary people, if they weren't protected by this British accredited registry foreign agents. And we've also got other foreign agents out there called neocons, or people with dual citizenship that claim to, have a claim to a one world government that is pretty well detailed in the protocols of the elders of Zion. And again, this ain't pointing a finger at all the Jews out there, just anybody that's, Christians alike, Muslims alike, being ruled and trying to exercise the oldest maxim in warfare, that's divide and conquer. But we've got the evidence here. We've got statement after statement after statement of the elite, of the intelligent, honorable, honest Jews out there like Benjamin Friedman. We've got all of this evidence. Who do we take it to if all of our law enforcement is compromised, if all of our Congress is compromised? How do the people restore their personal individual sovereignty? How do we do that? Who do we call on? Other than the only thing I can see is the militia, which is the people of the United States, as individuals. I think that's a real important point that you make.
Well, the militia will always be there, protect the country from foreign and domestic enemies, and can be called upon. And the National Peace Services Act basically commingled that with the UN mercs and so forth. That was how President Obama did that. The way out of it is certainly hampered by prosecutors and bar association court officers, where they try to control the grand jury system. And we've tested the grand jury system 3 times in the last decade and looked at it and then watched how the bar lawyers came in to tighten down the controls on grand juries. And basically, a grand jury relies on the fact in the settled law that people are sovereign, and they are the source of the sovereign authority and power. And with the preamble, you go back and look at a grand jury and you start saying, okay, what kind of a grand jury should this be? We've addressed, and written the criteria for a special grand jury. which steps out of the typical European concept of grand jury, petit jury, and all of those kinds of juries. And we've looked at the indigenous truth circles, and certainly they seem to have more patience and more authority in terms of making a decision that's not going to get turned over by some funky Supreme Court or some UN authority, because they are sovereigns. They are sovereign people, man, woman. Very important. So when we tested this the last time around, immediately the response out of some Indian authorities through the Bar Association kind of complex was to stop it and then get more control on tribal grand juries and regionalization, the intertribal court system. So they're tightening down in that respect. But sooner or later, when you have corrupted and perverse judges, and I don't mean they went out and drank too much or something like that. I mean where they actually perverted the law. They made a perversion of law, such as injecting common law into Indian country. The paradox is coming. They're going to have to face their own music, and it's not going to be real comfortable for a lot of bar lawyers. At that point, then you look at it, and you have to look at it and have people that are well-informed, very not angry people. Angry people will always go the wrong way. It's a pattern. So you want to stay with the idea that people can be good and reasonable, but they generally cannot be that when they're under extreme stress or in a position of cognitive reduction or dissonance, such as this country is right now. Indian country is worse. They have a few talking heads that pretend that they're the leadership and everything's okay. Sure it is for their secular group, for their nepotistic regime. So there's always, plus and minus. But the grand jury system can be effected, but it's going to take a really clear understanding of not a particular idea of confrontation, but of putting right what is wrong. And that's going to take principles and ethics and moral, preeminent moral leadership and all of those things. We've written continuity of interest, indigenous continuity of interest. We've diagrammed it and mapped it out. And at a moment when we were going to introduce that in Indian country, our operation got subverted and deferred and detained and marginalized, and so we just held back on it. And that's still pending. And there'll be a day when we put that out there, and then it'll show a not simple-minded, but a simplistic way to deal with getting people out of the austerity and out of the degradation that they're in Indian country. And believe me, there's a victimhood culture that keeps the Indian people in the mindset that they are victims. And the UN is a big part of that, constantly causing the problem and then managing it. And so you have the same people that cause the problems come back later as fixers, intermediaries, to be the so-called solution. And this is a complex endeavor to bring in grand juries. We're bringing in the next year teams of well-educated lawyers that will know how to deal with corrupt lawyers and judges. And they're going to go in and they're going to do field audits, and they're going to interview people, and they're going to talk to people, and they're going to get at it. But those lawyers have to be protected. So they're going to be protected so that if they get magically disbarred for the convenience of some secular politician or authority, that they walk away okay. And that's what it's going to take, because that expertise is crucial, because most people cannot even comprehend what law is anymore. Most people believe in this country, in this political moment, that law is that which is to the advantage of the majority, and that is a incredibly contrary idea to the Constitution.
Pretty naive point of view here. And these corporations, the UN, this whole government system, I've said there's a couple of things I can't tell you. I can't tell you if the government controls the media or if the media controls the government. But
the trilateral now is military, corporate, and institutional. President Clinton said, he said, we're going to change everything into institutional. He didn't quite qualify where he was going with that. But things like Waco were executed on purpose. The nature of what's going on is more force of law, and so the law is the organization, collective organization of the individual's right to defense, and you look at the laws of the United States, and the majority are contract law. Contract law is very different from the typical legislative kind of things that govern agencies and so forth. But as we see the commingling of the agencies and the commingling of the branch of the government and becoming the decider government, where you have collaborators deal with everything, you're going to have more and more and more problems. And always it runs like this. You have thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So always the synthesis is always pressured for the UN level as a international corporation. By the way, United Nations Eternal is an international religious corporation based on the fact that it runs the Temple of Understanding. And they're definitely occult level in their precepts.
Well, it was the Catholic Church that was behind most of the slaughter of the indigenous people, especially in South America and North America. And it is the Pope that supposedly, either the Pope or the Queen, that owns all the property in the world. You know, it's kind of makes me suspicious of the whole Christianity thing. If you read the Bible carefully, the Old Testament, whoever the God was of the Jews or of the Hebrews, he was one bloodthirsty sucker, wasn't he? And I don't believe that that's the God that Jesus talked about. I think Jesus tried to tell us that we have God within us, that we don't need the priests, we don't need the rabbis, we damn sure don't need the Pope. We've got God inside us, and we can call it a conscience, we can call it ESP, you can call it whatever you want, but I think we've really got it. And Jesus said, "You can do what I do and more," didn't he? What about that? Am I taking a negative look here?
Well, you're hitting right at some of the elements. The Constitution is the express principles of the general welfare. And in the general welfare, they use the word psyche, human psyche, development of the human psyche. So it's all there. The arbiter of the truth, you're talking the Pope, the Vatican, and all this conglomerate. And when they use consensus reality, they just merely make up the truth, what they want it to be. And they use consensus reality in determining exorcisms. So you're dealing with, that is transformed into the deciders. So here you have the religious quarter over here, and then all of a sudden you have the scientific quarter. And the scientific quarter says, we're going to do science as positivism, and we're going to disregard its dark side, and we're going to use precautionary principles such as the IPCC does on climate issues. So you're dealing with two diametrically appearing that are opposed entities that do the same thing, both believe, on a lack of fact. In other words, they don't have to prove it, they merely have to say it. And that's the nature of collaboration and the collaborative government forums. At a point, they simply select who they want to hear from to substantiate the end game. They put it in play. They eliminate dissenters and objectors and objectionists, like Hillary Clinton said. Objectionists. We have to get rid of the objectionists. Well, there's a new twist, new word. So we have to be careful that we look at full and explicit explanations. And in this context, attachment 1 on identity theft, that goes to God's perfect law of liberty. It's quite a lengthy section in the identity theft brief, and it explains a lot of this and how it works and who's in behind what, and the various laws and acts that apply, Northwest Ordinance, and so on and so forth.
All right, we're out of time, William Blair. Art George, I didn't hear much from you, Art, but we'll have you back on and give you all the time that you need, any time that you want it. And I would appreciate if you would send me anything that you would like to get into this October issue of the Free American, in addition to what you've already sent. What you've already said is already laid in. God bless you all. Thank you.
Won't tell you. At Truth Radio,
thank you very much.
Live, large selection of archived programs. TruthRadio.com. The truth is out there.
Did you have trouble?